Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to Prose 2. This is your ENG503 and another great short story, another very famous and very popular short story by Edgar Allan Poe today. In the last lecture we did Poe's story The Black Cat, and I hope you all enjoyed it. The one that we're going to do today is slightly different, and the wonderful thing about Poe is that with each story you have a different subject, but each story manages to grip the attention of the reader in such a way that you cannot think of anything else until you come to the climax or the end of the story. So in the previous lectures I told you that Poe is one of the greatest of short story writers. He is not an English short story writer, as in born in England or lived in England, but he's an American. So whatever he is writing about, you have to see it from the perspective of the Americans. And the first story that we did, if you remember, Some Words with a Mummy, he had talked about things in the United States of America and things that had happened in ancient Egypt. And he had talked about the ancient Egyptians having made more progress than Americans can ever boast about. And in The Black Cat, he had talked about a cat that the narrator keeps as pet, and ultimately he starts to dislike and hate the cat, kills the cat, and then kills his wife also. And at the end of the story you discovered how he sort of reveals to the police where the body of his wife was buried, and that was how they arrested him, and he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death row. So the story that I'm going to do today with you is, like I said before, one of the most famous and one of the most popular stories by Poe. It's titled A Descent into the Maelstrom, and you'll see how different this is from the two stories that you've done before. There are a lot of slides to this, but that as you know, is because I wanted to put the whole text in front of you, so that as I give the explanation, you go through the text on the slides and you don't have to search for your place in the accompanying textbook. So let us start with a descent into the Maelstrom and see what Poe has to tell us today. He starts off with a quote by Joseph Glanville, and he says, the ways of God in nature, as in providence, are not as our ways, nor are the models that we frame any way commensurate to the vastness, profundity, and unsearchableness of his works, which have a depth in them greater than the well of Democritus. So a reference to history, to philosophy, and the fact that no matter what man comes up with, what God has ordained for us, we cannot predict, we cannot forecast. So profound is his world, so vast is his world. So with this quote he launches into the story, and like Poe's other stories, you see that there is a narrator in this, and the story is written in the first person because this is a narrative that he's giving us. We had now reached the summit of the loftiest crag. For some minutes the old man seemed too much exhausted to speak. So the narrator is exploring the countryside with the help of a guide who he says is an old man. And he says that the old man seems to be out of breath, but when he can and he does regain his breath, here's what he says. Not long ago, and I could have guided you on this route as well as the youngest of my sons. But about 3 years past, there happened to me an event such as never happened to mortal man, and the 6 hours of deadly terror which I then endured have broken me up body and soul. So the narrator and the guide are exploring the rocks and the crags and the cliffs, and just when the narrator thinks that this old man is not really up to the task, the man says, 3 years ago I could have taken you anywhere because I knew this place like the back of my hand, but circumstances are different now. Something happened to me 3 years ago that does not allow me to travel as fast and with as great a confidence as I could before. Another thing that you'll notice is that Poe in the very beginning says that what he's going to say is very hard to believe. There are some stories in which he says nobody is going to believe what I'm writing, but I'm writing it down so that someone at some time, some point will be able to read this and will understand my situation and will believe what I am telling you. So in this story also he says that something happened to me which no human being could have endured, or which no human being has ever written about. You suppose me a very old man, but I am not. It took less than a single day to change these hairs from a jetty black to white, to weaken my limbs and to unstring my nerves so that I tremble at the least exertion and am frightened by a shadow. Do you know I can scarcely look over this little cliff without getting giddy? So this guide that he thinks is an old man says that this hair that has turned white has not turned white in years. This turned white within the span of a day. And it's not just my hair that turned white, but my nerves were shot to pieces. Physically, I cannot do the activities that I could do then. So he says, I knew my way around this countryside, but now I am unsure. Something happened 3 years ago which made me lose confidence in anything that I could do. Now the little cliff that he talks about and on whose edge he had so carelessly thrown himself down to rest, he says this little cliff was a sheer unobstructed precipice of black shining rock, some 15 or 1600 feet from the world of crags beneath us. Nothing would have tempted me to walk within a dozen yards of its brink. So you have a conversation between the narrator and the guide, and the guide talks about a little cliff which the narrator says it was no way a little cliff. It was a huge precipice, hundreds of feet from the surface of the sea. In truth, so deeply was I excited by the perilous position of my companion that I fell at full length upon the ground, clung to the shrubs around me, and dared not glance upward at the sky, while I struggled in vain to divest myself of the idea that the very foundations of the mountain were in danger from the fury of the winds. So this is wild countryside. There are rocks, there are precipices, there are crags, cliffs, and the narrator is very uncertain, very unsure of himself in this place. And the guide, whom he had taken to be an old man, says, "I'm not an old man. It's just that my hair has grown white and I have become very unsure of my physical and mental abilities." So the narrator says that whatever the guide said was a little cliff, was a huge precipice that I could never have been brave enough to even look at. You must get over these fancies. When the guide sees him, he says, "This is all your imagination, for I have brought you here that you might have the best possible view of the scene of that event I mentioned, and to tell you the whole story with the spot just under your eye. So I've brought you here because I want you to see this place, and as you're watching this place, I am going to narrate the story of what happened to me 3 years ago." We are now close upon the Norwegian coast, and then he gives specifications. He says the 68th degree of latitude in the great province of Nordland and in the dreary district of Lofoten. Please do not get upset by some of these Norwegian names. They're difficult for us to pronounce, and I'm going to try to give you the exact pronunciation. If you want to double check, you can always go to one of those links for pronunciation and see whether the way that I'm pronouncing it matches with what your internet sources give you as the correct pronunciation. So they're on the Norwegian coast in the district of Lofoten, and the guide is going to show him something that he would not ordinarily be able to see and experience. And he says, if you feel giddy, you can hold on to these bushes and these shrubs. I looked dizzily and beheld a wide expanse of ocean whose waters were so inky a hue as to bring at once to my mind the Nubian geographer's account of the Mare Tenebrarum. I looked dizzily and beheld a wide expanse of ocean whose waters were so inky a hue as to bring at once to my mind the Nubian geographer's account of the Mare Tenebrarum. So one of those words that it's going to be difficult to pronounce. A panorama more deplorably desolate no human imagination can conceive. This is the narrator's viewpoint. He looks out upon the sea and he says nothing could be as desolate as this scene. To the right and left, as far as the eye could reach, there lay outstretched like ramparts of the world, lines of horribly black and beetling cliff, whose character of gloom was but the more forcibly illustrated by the surf which reared high up against its white and ghastly crest, howling and shrieking forever. So the entire scene is not just visual, but it has to be experienced with the ear also, because the sound that the surf makes is so overpowering that combined with this huge expanse of water and these towering cliffs. It's a magnificent scene, and yet it is desolate because you do not see any human life there. Just opposite the promontory upon whose apex we were placed, at a distance of some 5 or 6 miles out at sea, there was visibly a small, bleak-looking island, or more properly, its position was discernible through the wilderness of surge in which it was enveloped. So here he's giving you an example of the detailed description that Poe has made in this short story. And so he says that as I looked out upon the expanse of the ocean, I was wonderstruck by the scene. Now you can just imagine they are at the top of this sort of mountain, and from this high vantage point they can look down at the expanse of water. They can see very far because they're really high up. And they're so high up that the narrator says, I felt faint, I felt dizzy because of the height that I had climbed, and then because of what I saw spread out before me. So he sees these islands, and he says that the appearance of the ocean had something very unusual about it, and he's going to tell us what it was that was unusual. He says there was a very strong wind blowing, and yet there was no what they call regular swell. There was a strong wind blowing, but it did not move the waves. It didn't create waves in the ocean. And of foam there was little except in the immediate vicinity of the rocks. One would expect that when there is a very strong wind, the surface of the sea would have a lot of high waves and some small waves. So then the guide, because he's basically a guide, he starts to tell him about those islands which he sees as very tiny pieces of land. He sees them almost as spots, and the narrator wonders why they were even named. But the guide, because that's a part of his function, is going to explain why all these islands have been named and why all these small islands are important. So he says, concentrate, focus. Do you hear any change in the sound? Do you see any change in the water? And as the old man spoke, I became aware of a loud and gradually increasing sound like the moaning of a vast herd of buffaloes upon an American prairie. And at the same moment I perceived that what seamen term the chopping character of the ocean beneath us was rapidly changing into a current which set to the eastward. So when the guide points out to him that there's something that he needs to listen for, and he concentrates, he realizes that not only is the surface of the ocean changing, but there is a sound like that of the moaning of a huge herd of buffaloes. So even while I gazed, this current acquired a monstrous velocity. See the words that Poe uses? Difficult to pronounce. Each moment added to its speed, to its headlong impetuosity. In 5 minutes, the whole sea, as far as Varag, was lashed into ungovernable fury. but it was between Moscow and the coast that the main uproar held its sway. So now the narrator also can pinpoint where most of the action in the ocean is taking place. The vast bed of the waters, seamed and scarred into 1,000 conflicting channels, burst suddenly into frenzied convulsion, heaving, boiling and hissing, gyrating in gigantic and innumerable vortices. You know what a vortex is? You know what a whirlpool is? That is another name for a vortex. It's when you have a body of water which has a kind of funnel in the center, so that the water moves round and round instead of having a linear motion. It's a circular motion, and anything that is caught in the water or in the maelstrom or in the vortex is taken deep into the vortex. So he says that what I saw was the formation of not just one vortex, but an innumerable vortices, and all whirling and plunging. So there's a lot of action that is taking place on the surface of the water. Another few minutes and he says there came over the scene another radical alteration. And this alteration is that the general service grew more smooth and the whirlpools disappeared. So it's very short-lived, but it is fantastic in the view that it presents. And then he says, while the water seemed to sort of calm down, there were these prodigious streaks of foam which formed on the surface of the water, and these streaks, they spread out into a great distance, combined with each other, and took up unto themselves the gyratory motion of the subsided vortices. So those small vortices, they collapse and they form a gigantic vortex. Okay? Suddenly, very suddenly, this assumed a distinct and definite existence in a circle of more than a mile in diameter. A mile from one point to another point. This body of water that has turned into a vortex is a mile in diameter. So if this is the circle, this line is the diameter, and from one point to another point it was 1 mile. So one huge vortex. And the sound of the vortex increased until the narrator says it would have drowned out the sound of the Niagara Falls. For those of you who have been to Niagara Falls or who have seen movies in which the Niagara Falls is shown, within a huge radius, you can hear no sound. So mighty, so great is the volume of water that is coming over the falls that it drowns out all other sounds. So he says that the sound created by this gigantic vortex drowned out all other sounds and would have drowned out the sound made by the Niagara Falls if the falls could be compared to anything. The mountain trembled to its very base and the rock rocked. I threw myself upon my face and clung to the scant herbage in an excess of nervous agitation. So the narrator becomes very nervous when he sees this happening. It's almost as if the mountain is going to be dislodged and it's going to fall into this gigantic vortex. This, he says, can be nothing else than the great whirlpool of the maelstrom. So the guide says, this is what I want to talk to you about. So when the narrator says this must be the whirlpool of the maelstrom, the guide corrects him and he says, you know, we Norwegians do not call it the maelstrom. We call it the Moscow-strom because of the island of Moscow. You wanted to know why we had given names to the islands. Well, this is one reason why these small islands have been given names, to identify these vortices. So he says that the ordinary accounts of this vortex had by no means prepared me for what I saw. When somebody says something about a particular wonder of nature, you take it all as something that's ordinary. But until you experience it for yourself, you cannot imagine the wonder, the fascination, the awe in which it is held by people. So he says, I had heard about the maelstrom, but nothing had prepared me for what I experienced myself. The account that has been given in writing of Jonas Ramus, he says, is the most circumstantial, that is the most correct. But even that does not give to you even an iota of the feeling that this gigantic maelstrom or this gigantic vortex inspires in your heart. I'm not sure from what point of view the writer in question surveyed it, nor at what time, but it could neither have been from the summit of Helseggen nor during a storm. So he says that, you know, I saw this on an ordinary day, but Jonas Ramus describes it in such a way as if he has never experienced it himself. Between Lofoten and Moscow, and now he gives you an excerpt from the description given by Jonas Ramus. This is how he writes about the maelstrom, or the Moscow-strom as the Norwegians call it. He says, between Lofoten and Moscow, the depth of the water is between 36 and 40 fathoms. But on the other side, towards Vurrgh, this depth decreases so as not to afford a convenient passage for a vessel, without the risk of splitting on the rocks, which happens even in the calmest weather. So he says that this is a place where a lot of marine accidents have taken place, and the account that Jonas Ramus gives is very matter of fact. It does not do justice to the immensity of the body of water. And Jonas Ramus goes on to say, when it is flood, the stream runs up the country between Lofoten and Moscow with a boisterous rapidity, but the roar of its impetuous ebb to the sea is scarce equaled by the loudest and most dreadful cataract. So the Niagara Falls cannot compete. The noise being heard several leagues off, and the vortices are of such an extent and depth that if a ship comes within its attraction, it is inevitably absorbed and carried down to the bottom, and there beat to pieces against the rocks. So in other words, what he is trying to say is that this is a very, very circumstantial description, a very factual description. It doesn't leave anything at all to the imagination. So he gives this detail about the description that Jonas Ramus has given, and he says, when the stream is most boisterous and its fury heightened by a storm, it is dangerous to come within a Norway mile of it. Now I looked up what a Norway mile meant, and roughly speaking it's about 10 kilometers. So if anybody tells you anything about a Norway mile, then you will see that the distance that is mentioned is about 10 kilometers. Okay, so he says, in the year 1645, early in the morning of Segasima Sunday, it raged with such noise and impetuosity that the very stones of the house on the coast fell to the ground. So the houses could not withstand the vibration, and many houses experienced this sudden noise that was emitted. And he says the narrators of the opinion that the individual who wrote about the Maelstrom could not actually have visited, could not actually have climbed onto the mountain Helseggen. Looking down from this pinnacle upon the howling Phlegethon below, I could not help smiling at the simplicity with which the honest Jonas Ramus records the anecdotes of the whales and the bears, for it appeared to me, in fact, a self-evident thing that the largest ship of the line in existence, coming within the influence of that deadly attraction, could resist it as little as a feather in a hurricane. So comparison being made of Jonas Ramus's description, and Poe tries to tell us the plus and minus points of having this gigantic vortex spread out in front of you. The attempts to account for the phenomenon seemed to me sufficiently plausible in perusal, but they now wore a very different and unsatisfactory aspect. So when you're reading something that's written down, there's a totally different feeling that comes over you, and when you actually experience this for yourself, and it can be anything in audio, anything in visual, it can be anything that is termed as audiovisual. So he says that that description is all right, but it doesn't prepare you for the impact that the actual scene has on a human being. And then he gives you a quotation from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which again is a descriptive image, and it tells you about the maelstrom or about the vortex, but it tells you in very plain and simple words, so that they're easy to understand, but it does not have the impact of actually looking at this huge, this gigantic vortex. Kircher and others imagined that in the center of the channel of the Maelstrom is an abyss penetrating the globe and issuing in some very remote part, the Gulf of Bosnia being somewhat decidedly named in one instance. So there's one other person that he mentions having written about the Maelstrom, and his name is Kircher, and he says that the description that Kircher and others imagine is that in the center of this vortex there is a kind of hole, a hole that passes through the earth and comes out on the other side. The kind of ideas that people had are very strange. So it says that one side comes out in the Gulf of Bosnia and the other side is here. But the guide says, you know, this is the view that was generally entertained by all Norwegians. This is not what his view is like, and then he tells the narrator what his view is like. Says, we've had a good look at the whirlpool, and if you'll creep around this crag so as to get into its lee and deaden the roar of the water, I will tell you a story that will convince you I ought to know something of the maelström. So there is this other description that the guide has, because the guide says that I have lived in this area and I have personally experienced this vortex. So what I am telling you is that it's not what is given out in the books. So the guide tells him to move around so that he can hear the sound of his voice, because remember, when this maelstrom or this maelström develops, there is that huge volume of sound that does not allow him to hear anything. So he says, if we can just move around, you will be able to hear what I have to say. And that is when the guide starts his story, and he says, myself and my two brothers once oared a schooner-rigged smack of about 70 tons burden, with which we were in the habit of fishing among the islands beyond Moscow, nearly to Varag. So he says that my brothers and I, we were fishermen, and we caught a lot of fish between the island of Moscow and the island of Varag. Now you see why he gives the names of all these islands. They may not mean anything to you, but they mean a lot to the narrator and the guide. And he says that there's a lot of good fishing in these waters, but that is nothing compared to the kind of fishing that we got at this special place where my brothers and I used to fish. And he says that most of the fishermen, they fished very close to shore, and we three were the only ones who would go so far out, because the quality of the fish that we caught there could not be compared with the quality of the fish that the fishermen caught in these areas close to the shore. So not only was the quality of the fish better, but he says that in one day we could catch so much fish that the other fishermen could not catch in 1 week. So there's two things, quantity and quality. The number of fish also increases, and they get more fish when they go farther out than when they stay close to shore. But of course, when you go out to a farther point, then there is the risk of life standing instead of labor, and courage answering for capital. So it took a lot of courage, it took a lot of stamina to go out onto these two islands and fish from there. We get the smack in a cove about 5 miles higher up the coast than this, and it was our practice in fine weather to take advantage of the 15 minutes slack to push across the main channel of the Maelstrom, far above the pool, and then drop down anchorage somewhere near Otterholm or Sandflesen, where the eddies are not so violent as elsewhere. So they had a ship, and it was it could take the load of 70 tons, and in this ship, he says his brothers and he were in the habit of going out to catch fish. And this is where this place at Maelstrom is where they would stay until it was time for slack water, or rather what is known as the ebb tide. And he says that there were times when we had to spend time there because there was this very short window of 15 minutes that would open up for them. In those 15 minutes, they would dash across that dangerous area and be safe home in their own waters before long. So he says that this is something that we had to do a lot of calculations about. And this place that he says that the brothers used to go to, they had to be very careful about the time, and he says that twice during the 6 years that they fished there, they were stranded because that window of 15 minutes slack they missed out, and so they had to stay there because there's no way that they could cross from where they were fishing to the shore if they missed that window out. Remember, it is because they had to spend the whole day there, and at the end of the day there was only that one 15-minute window that they had, and if they missed that out, there was no way that they could risk crossing over in the dark. So they had to stay there for days. They nearly starved, but they could not take that risk because that would have meant certain death. So he says that, you know, this was something that they just could not risk. It was a big risk going to that place to catch the fish, but then the fish that they caught, it was worth the risks that they took. And he says, I can't tell you the 20th part of the difficulties that we encountered in this fishing area, or as he says, on the grounds. It's a bad spot to be in, even in good weather. But we had to take advantage of the Maelstrom to not only to get the fish, but also to come back. Sometimes it happened that the wind was not as strong as we thought, and it was just a matter of minutes before we escaped being caught in the Maelstrom. Then he goes on to give a sort of description of their family, and he says that my eldest brother had a son who was 18 years old, and I myself had 2 boys, and these boys would have been very helpful to us if we had taken them along for fishing, but something that we could bear for ourselves, we could not bear for our boys. We didn't want to put them to that risk, and it's something that we could do for ourselves, but as far as our children were concerned, we were just not ready to take that risk. So he says, it is within a few days of 3 years since that I'm going to tell you what occurred. It was in the date that he gives is 10th July. The year that the year he does not give. He says 18 and then he leaves a blank. I says a day which the people of this part of the world will never forget, for it was one in which there was the most terrible hurricane. And now you get an idea of what he's heading towards and what you are going to be able to see. So he says all morning and indeed until late in the afternoon there was a gentle and steady breeze, and in this gentle and steady breeze they continued to fish because the sun was shining brightly, and the oldest seaman amongst us could not have predicted what would happen. You know, seamen and the traditional people say that they can sense the changes in the atmosphere. If there's a hurricane or if there's going to be a strong wind, there are going to be gales, or there are going to be other natural disasters. They can sense it, but on this particular day he says that nobody could sense what was going to happen because it came upon us so suddenly. So the 3 brothers, they crossed over to the island around 2 o'clock, and within a few hours they had loaded their ship, the schooner, or as he calls it, the smack, with very fine fish, and they were feeling very happy that, you know, they would be able to make some money out of it. It was just 7 by my watch when we weighed and started for home. So they picked up anchor and started for home so that they could take opportunity of that window and cross the Maelstrom quickly. We set out with a fresh wind on our starboard quarter and for some time spanked along at a great rate. So the ship or the boat moved fast, and they were making very good time. All at once, he says, we were taken aback by a breeze from over Helseggen. So there was a breeze coming from across the mountain, and this was most unusual because it had never happened before. So the guide begins to feel uneasy without exactly knowing why. He feels uneasy when he feels that breeze, and he starts thinking, you know, this has never happened before, so why is it happening now? We put the boat on the wind but could make no headway at all for the eddies, and so they get caught in these tiny little vortices that are forming. And when he tries to take advantage of the wind that is blowing, he finds that the wind will not move them since the current of the water is stronger than the force of the wind. And this guide is on the point of suggesting that they should go back to where they had put down anchor, when he looks towards the stern and he sees this huge copper-colored cloud which rose with the most amazing velocity. So it comes up with such a speed that soon it is above them. So the breeze that had started off by pushing them towards the shore, that dies down, and they're just sitting there, drifting here, drifting there, because the current of the water takes them here and there, but there's no wind to move the boat. So this did not last long enough to give us time to think about it. In less than a minute, the storm was upon us. So what happens is that the storm comes so fast that they do not have time to prepare themselves. It became dark, and they saw that cloud had overtaken, and a hurricane blew that it is a folly to attempt to describe. So then you had hurricane winds, and it says you cannot imagine what happened to us or the kind of winds that blew. They were so strong, so ferocious, that they destroyed our sails, and they destroyed the mast. You know, the mast is that sort of post, that wooden post from which the flag is displayed. And these winds, they are so strong that they take away the sails of the boat, they take away the mast. And it happens so fast, it's as if, you know, it has been sawn off. That is how fast it goes. Now, when the winds start to blow, each one of the brothers holds on to something for security. And the youngest brother had tied himself to the main mast because he was afraid of being blown away. And when the mast is blown, it takes the youngest brother with him. So they lose the youngest brother. That leaves two brothers. And then he says that they felt as if their boat was as light as a feather, because it was being moved here and there by the current of water, by the strong wind that was blowing. So this boat is being tossed and turned, and the two brothers who remain on the boat, one of them holds on to the hatch, and the guide, who is the narrator of the actual story of the descent into the Maelstrom, he holds on to this ring bolt. These are the two things that are secure in the boat, and the volume of water is such that they seem to be buried in the boat, but they're both holding on, and they cannot see anything. It is dark. There's this a huge amount of water that is all around us. There's a very strong gale force wind that is blowing, and the two brothers do not know what has happened to the third brother. They can hardly see each other because of the hurricane wind that is blowing. So each of them is holding on to something that appears to them to be strong and stable. For some moments, he says, we were completely deluged. There was this enormous amount of water, and he says that we just hung on for dear life. When I could stand it no longer, I raised myself upon my knees, still keeping hold with my hands, and thus got my head clear. So, you know, they're engulfed by water, And yet he says that when I could take it no longer, I just raised myself onto my knees. I'm still holding on to that ring bolt, but I wanted to get my head clear. I wanted my head to be out of the water. Now about this time, their little boat gives itself a shake, and the narrator says, just as a dog does in coming out of the water, and thus rid herself in some measure of the seas. So this is something that is beyond their control. They are in the boat, they're holding on for dear life, but they don't know what is going to happen to them. And when he looks around him, he sees his elder brother, and he's happy because he knows he has lost one brother, but he still has his elder brother. But at this time, his elder brother whispers one word in his ear, and this one word changes the perception of this guide narrator forever. And the word that he whispers is maelstrom. So what happens then? No one will ever know what my feelings were at that moment. All their fishing lives, they had avoided the maelstrom, and now they are in the maelstrom. He says, I shook from head to foot as if I were in an egg. That is how powerful this feeling is of what has happened to them. How could it possibly have happened? How could they have been caught in the maelstrom? And he says that one word was enough to scare the life out of me, because this is something that we have tried to avoid. And at this particular moment, with that hurricane blowing, they are caught in that maelstrom. So not only are they caught in that gigantic vortex, but they also have such a strong wind blowing that they can neither control their boat, nor can they be sure that they will survive this. The vortex in itself, the maelstrom or the maelstrom, is enough in itself without having hurricane force winds blowing and blowing them hither and thither. So we're going to stop here, but I'm going to continue this in the next lecture also. I told you when we started off that this is a longish short story, because there's a lot of descriptive detail, and the language that Poe uses is very powerful. The imagery that he evokes before our eyes is so powerful that it almost takes us out of ourselves and puts us in that situation that Poe's characters are experiencing. So in order to quickly go through what we did today, Poe starts off the story, a descent into the maelstrom, by this description of a climb over the mountain Helseggen with a guide who appears to be very old because all his hair is white. He feels dizzy. He doesn't have strong nerves. So once they have climbed up to the mountain, the guide says, I've brought you here because I want you to experience for yourself something that you will never be able to do from any point other than this. If you look at the sea or the ocean from any other point, you will not be able to experience it the way you can do it looking from here. And he further explains that I'm not an old man. I may look old, but that's because my hair is white. That's because I do not have control over my bodily functions, and my nervous system is not as strong as it used to be. And this whole thing happened about 3 years ago, when within the span of a single day, within the span of 6 hours in fact, that his hair went from jet black to total white, snow white. And he says, during those 6 hours, my nerves were shot to pieces. My body developed shivers that I have not been able to get rid of in all these years. So I've brought you here because I want you to experience for yourself what this entire thing is all about. And when he starts to draw the attention of the narrator to what is happening on the surface of the ocean, he sees that the surface of the ocean, which had appeared to be very calm in spite of the wind that was blowing off the mountain, it changes suddenly so that small whirlpools appear upon the surface of the ocean. Now you can imagine the two of them on the top of the mountain, and they're looking down at this expanse of the ocean, and they see these small vortices developing on the surface of the ocean. And then while they're watching, these vortices appear to dissolve into one gigantic vortex. And in this vortex, there is this huge amount of water that's going round and round. And the guide tells the narrator of the story that this is a phenomenon which you will not observe anywhere else. And at this point, the narrator, who actually starts off the written portion of the story, says, so this is the maelstrom? And the guide says, this, you call it the maelstrom. I am a Norwegian, and we Norwegians refer to it as the Moskostrom. And it is called the Moskostrom because of the island that is closest to this place. And he points out the various islands, he gives the names, and he says that there's only one person who has written in a lot of detail about this phenomenon of nature. And it's a descriptive detail. It mentions the different aspects, but it is based upon a minute description. There are no feelings, no emotions involved. The story that I am going to tell you is a true story. And then he starts off by telling him that he is one of 3 brothers, and these 3 brothers, they used to fish off the coast of Moscow because that is where you get the best fish, and what they could get in one day was about the same as what the fishermen catching fish very close to the shore would get in 1 week. So not only would they get more fish, but they would also get a finer quality of fish. And so he describes this one day in the 19th century, and he says that the inhabitants of this place remember that day very clearly, because there was the most terrible hurricane that they had experienced. And that on that day, there were absolutely no indications in the morning that there was going to be a hurricane. So he and his brothers, one elder, the other younger, they set out to fish. And they reached the island of Moscow by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 7 they had finished, and they had started off, because there was this one window of 15 minutes that they wanted to take advantage of, because they wanted to cross the Maelstrom during those 15 minutes when the tide was ebbing, so that the waters were calm and there was no danger involved. And he says that when they were crossing over, all of a sudden there was a very strong wind blowing. The boat was tossed and turned over, and we all feared for our lives. So my younger brother quickly tied himself to the main mast, but the tragedy is that the main mast was one of the first things that was taken off by the strong wind that was blowing. And in time, he says that I was able to see that my elder brother was also holding on to the hatch, or the metal cover, and I was holding on to the ring bolt, because not only was the boat being tossed about by the water, but there was also that gale blowing. And soon after that, he says, I grew tired of being deluged by the water, so I tried to raise myself on my knees, and the first thing that I saw was that my elder brother was also holding on. While this was very heartening, I was also upset when my brother whispered in my ear that one magical word that changed my perception of the day forever, and that word was Maelstrom. So the elder brother, being more experienced, realized that they were caught in the Maelstrom, and if they escaped with their lives, it would be a huge miracle. I think we've done enough for today. We'll complete this story in the next lecture, inshallah. So until that time, Allah Hafiz.